Thanks. And can everyone see the screen okay? Just double checking. Yep. Okay. Great. Okay. Okay, so today we're going to reflect upon the content of Marty Brannigan's really interesting lecture from a peace studies perspective on nuclear weapons and whether they should be used. And we're going to take a kind of step back and consider the questions behind all that, this question about the relationship between morality and war. So this is our question. War fundamentally involves killing, and usually killing is regarded as morally wrong. So how can war ever be morally justified? This is the problem. So basically, in answer to that question, we can divide the views and responses or defenses into 4 broad categories. Firstly, romantic militarism, which romanticizes war and waging war. The idea is even that it's good, it's virtuous, because war in general, on this view, is essential to fostering moral virtues. You might think this is a bit strange, but it was very popular at the time. Pacifism, war is always and everywhere immoral, never morally justified. And we saw this position put forward in a peace studies context by Marty Brannigan. Realism, so political realism basically, but as applied to the notion of war. The idea that morality is basically irrelevant to war. So arguments about whether war is moral or not ultimately end up being beside the point. Well, what's the point? Well, the point is because realistically, they argue, you don't really have a choice. You have to, defend your country or whatever it is. You just have to do what you have to do, and war is part of what you have to do. So it's sort of an argument from, pragmatics. It's a pragmatic argument. You're stuck in a situation, and the only way forward is war, and that's it. And there's no point in arguing about the morality because this is the only thing to do. You just have to be realistic about what you have to do. And then we have just war theory, which we'll be spending on some time today, which is quite complex, actually. The idea that, at least in principle, some wars can be morally justified, but only for at most one side. So you can't argue that everybody, all the sides, the different forces in the war are all in the right. And we'll talk a bit more about that. And even then, only under very specific circumstances. So as we'll see, there's a lot of detail to this. And as we go through just war theory, you might start to ask yourself, well, are any wars ever really justified on this view? So it is quite interesting because it's so stringent as a collection of conditions that war is meant to meet. So just a little bit more about this concept of romantic militarism. We see this in the work of the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who's often associated with the Enlightenment in Europe and wrote on ethics, among other things. But you see it coming, we call it romantic, and it is also associated with some aspects of the Romantic movement in the 19th century. So this is what Kant says in the Critique of Judgment, which is from 1790, which is a famous work of ethics. And he says, war itself, provided it is conducted with order and a sacred respect for the rights of civilians, that is, not soldiers, has something sublime about it, and gives nations that carry it on in such a manner a stamp of mind only the more sublime, the more numerous the dangers to which they are exposed, and which they are able to meet with fortitude, a kind of bravery and strength. On the other hand, a prolonged peace favours the predominance of a mere commercial spirit, and with it a debasing self-interest, cowardice and effeminacy, very sexist word there, and tends to degrade the character of the nation, end quote. So Kant, who was by no means, he had a lot to say about people's rights and respecting people and talking about treating people as ends and not means to an end, surprisingly has this view about war. And so this idea that war will basically make people more virtuous, and the absence of war, what he calls a prolonged peace, might be good in some ways, but ultimately makes people kind of selfish and complacent and just wanting to do business and not caring about, higher matters. So it's an interesting perspective, but seems, a little unempathic towards the victims of war. So another kind of interesting take on romantic militarism is by the pragmatic philosopher William James. And he wrote this piece called The Moral Equivalent of War. And basically he's also romanticizing militarism, but saying you can do it without the war. So this purpose can be achieved, but without war. So he says, reflective apologists for war, that is defenders of war, at the present day all take it religiously. It is a sort of sacrament. Its profits are to the vanquished as well as to the victor, and quite apart from any question of profit, it is considered to be an absolute good, we are told, for it is human nature at its highest dynamic. Its horrors are a cheap price to pay for rescue from the only alternative supposed of a world of clerks and teachers, of co-education and zoophilie, of consumers' leagues and associated charities, of industrialism unlimited and feminism unabashed. No scorn, no hardness, no valour anymore. Fie upon such a cattle yard of a planet. So this is his take on the kind of romantic militarism he's sort of reacting against. And he's picking out that, there's aspects to this which just seem kind of ludicrous. But he's also kind of questioning the dichotomy that they're setting up here, that if you don't have a war, then all this stuff, this bad stuff is going to happen to people. So he suggests an alternative. If now, and this is my idea, there were, instead of military conscription, a conscription of the whole youthful population, I'm pretty sure he just means boys here, to form for a certain number of years a part of the army enlisted against nature, to coal and iron mines, to freight trains, to fishing fleets in December, to dishwashing, clothes washing and window washing, to road building and tunnel making, to foundries and stokeholes, and be the frame of skyscrapers, would our gilded youths be drafted off according to their choice to get the childishness knocked out of them and to come back into society with healthier sympathies and sober ideas. They would have paid their blood tax, done their own part in the immemorial human warfare against nature. They would tread the earth more proudly. The women would value them more highly, and they would be better fathers and teachers of the following generation. So an interesting alternative, but I still think sounds rather militaristic in terms of what he's proposing here. Hopefully wouldn't be, it's an improvement perhaps because it doesn't involve killing people, or not intentionally. But this idea that there's something kind of wrong with the human population as they stand, and that unless they're forced into something, there has to be some sort of equivalent of military conscription for them to ever become adults and become better and so on. And all sorts of assumptions about gender going on here as well. So you have this interesting kind of debate happening throughout with this romantic militaristic idea. And so if it's not actual militarism, it's a kind of pseudo-militarism that's meant to kind of save the population and make them more mature and more virtuous. So we talked about, we just looked a little bit at that romanticization of war. And then there's two groups that definitely don't romanticize war, and two groups that you would think have not that much in common. But we've got this basic issue of compatibilism versus incompatibilism. Are war and morality compatible or not? And in some sense, the pacifists and the realists, the political realists, are united on this issue because both are incompatibilists about war. They both assert that war and morality are totally incompatible. They are mutually exclusive. The realist says, well, if war and morality, you can't have both, let's ditch morality. Let's just have war. War is the only way to realistically, defend yourself, live your life, defend your country and so on. You just have to do that. So let's just accept that. Let's not bother with these questions of morality. And of course, the pacifist takes the other route, which is to reject war, that nothing is worth rejecting our morality for. So if there's any conflict between these two, of course, you have to go with morality. I think it's worth noting that the political realist doesn't so much think that war is immoral in the sense it's incompatible with morality, as that they think war is amoral, that it just doesn't have any kind of qualities that you should judge as moral or immoral, considering it's just a matter of pragmatically trying to get stuff done that has to be done. So apart from these two, kind of sitting apart from these two and contradicting those two are the just war theorists, who are in some sense compatibilists. They think some wars and some ways of conducting wars are compatible with morality. They're morally acceptable and they're not incompatible with morality, at least. So because it's quite moderate in this way, because just war theorists are not saying war is always and everywhere okay, but only under certain conditions, then it becomes important to unpack those conditions. So, just war theory holds that wars can be just or unjust. And this goes back a very long way, but it was particularly developed by certain medieval scholastic philosophers, such as Thomas Aquinas, who would sort of systematically write out all the conditions. They loved setting everything out as, you know, reasons and logic, and so they would go into all the detail and set it all out. So there's two important principles here, or questions that we have to ask, which are usually expressed in Latin. So first is jus ad bellum, which is the question of the justice in going to war. So bellum is this word in Latin for war. You might have heard the term belligerent. If someone's belligerent, they're always trying to start fights and wars and arguments. They're just constantly looking for conflict, right? So under this principle, the question is, in what circumstances can one be justified in going to war? So what underpins a decision to declare war or to go to war? Now, once you declare war and you're in the war, then you have this other issue, and this is called jus in bello. So the question of the justice in the war, once you've started the war. So we could express this as, how should one conduct oneself in war, during the war, right? So in order for a war to be just, there needs to be both jus ad bellum and jus in bello, right? There has to be a good reason to go to war in the first place, and you have to conduct yourself morally in the war. So both of those are necessary. So how do we determine the answers to these questions? So what we have to do is basically go through the criteria of the just war tradition. So over time, various philosophers added criteria to what makes a war just, so conditions or requirements. So we can go through those criteria and see what they say about our wars and how plausible they are as criteria. So particularly in terms of what's going on in the world now, as we go through these conditions, you might want to think to yourself, do they or do they not apply to the current conflict in the Ukraine? And more broadly, of course, the question, do you think that there can ever be a just war? Can anything meet all these conditions? So we need both to make the war just according to the just war theorists. Even if the war itself is just, we still must pursue war in a moral way. So it's not a case of saying, I've got a good reason to go to war and now I can do anything I want. And this is expressed, for instance, in the Geneva Convention, which gives you rules about how to treat prisoners of war and so on. You can't just do anything you like to anyone. So the principle behind this is there's no good pursuing war in a moral way if the war itself is not just. So you could declare war and then not pursue it in a moral way, or you could pursue that war in a moral way, but you didn't actually have a moral reason to do it in the first place. So if we look firstly at jus ad bellum, possible reasons that justify going to war. War is justified if and only if, which is it's kind of logical phrase that means only under all of these conditions and not if it doesn't meet all of these conditions. If and only if it satisfies the following conditions. And we'll have a chat about all of these. Firstly, just cause. So just reason to cause you to go to war. Second, right authority. The question of who has authority to declare war, make war. Question of right intent. What are your intentions going to war? What do you intend to do? Number 4, peaceful ultimate goals. You cannot go to war to just have power. Your ultimate goal has to be something to do with peace. Number 5, it has to be a last resort. So you have to have tried everything else before you can start war. There has to be a reasonable chance of success. Well, this is a tricky one. How do you measure that? And finally, the principle of proportionality. So what you do in the war has to be proportional to the good you're trying to get out of it. So that relates to how many people die in the pursuit of your goal of peace. So if we accept there's a morally sound reason for going to war, or so it's argued, what would that be? Well, one model is the response to aggression, or the self-defense model. So we justify going to war because some other country usually attacked us, invaded us, hurt us, and we're just trying to defend ourselves. It's not that we want to have a fight, but we're just trying to defend ourselves, and we have a right to do this. And that's probably the first one you think of in terms of possibly justifying war. But there's other possible grounds that I'm sure you're familiar with. For instance, coming to the defence of nations or peoples that are under attack and are unable to defend themselves. So, for instance, a group of people who are in the news a lot at the moment are the Taiwanese, and there's a lot of tension over whether, if China made a move towards them, America and its allies, which include Australia, would they get involved, should they get involved, and so on. So it's not just about your country and situation, but about others for whom you might feel some responsibility. Then there's regime change, removing a tyrannical government, for instance. And so this is where you get an internal conflict in a country or some kind of state or territory where the government has become corrupt, there's some issue with the government, you consider the government to be immoral, and this appears to be the only way to get rid of that government and install a just government. And then kind of related to that, there's revolutionary wars, wars of national liberation. There's this idea of liberating a country or an ethnic group, and in order to do that, you have to wage total revolution, and war is part of that. It may not be all of it, but it's part of that massive revolution in favour of freedom. So I'm sure you can think of examples, your own examples, for all these possible grounds. So there's a question of how we should understand aggression. So here's how it's described in a document of the UN General Assembly. Aggression is the use of armed force by a state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of another state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the Charter of the United Nations. So it references the concept of a state, some kind of territory that claims sovereignty, claims the right to rule itself, is separate to others, is independent of others. And so it's very, very much about the concepts of states and their independence. And so some peace activists have made the point that if we didn't have borders, we wouldn't have these problems, that the borders are part of the problem. So some people advocate for a world without borders, because there wouldn't be so much of this kind of issue if you weren't so territorial about your the places you live. And others say, no, that's very utopian. So that's a debate that happens behind all of this. So there's some objections to this idea of war as a response to aggression. So some people argue it might be too strong. That is, do states always have the right or even obligation to resort to war in response to aggression? That just because someone is aggressive towards you, does that automatically justify this kind of response? And certainly if we think of that condition of needing to be a last resort, you might argue, yes, this is too strong. That aggression itself doesn't automatically justify a right to respond with war. And then other people have argued that it's perhaps too weak. And one person who argued this was, or asked this question, I guess, was GEM Ansco, a woman philosopher who was writing in the mid-century to late 20th century. And she wrote this in an article about war and murder. She said, "The present-day concept of aggression is a bad one. Why must it be wrong to strike the first blow in a struggle? The only question is, who is right?" So she thinks kind of aggression is beside the point. The question is, are you in the right morally about what it is you're trying to achieve? It doesn't really matter who casts the first stone. You have to be thinking about what it is you're fighting for. And if it's right, then you have a right to fight for it. So interestingly, G.M. Anscombe, or as she was also known, Elizabeth Anscombe, was actually quite famous or infamous for being very, very anti-nuclear war in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And she'd go on anti-nuclear protests, and there was this controversy where she opposed President Truman being given a special medal because she didn't approve of the decision to drop the atomic bomb. So she was an interesting character, one of the few women in philosophy at that time, and if you're interested, worth looking up. So if response to aggression is the paradigm example, the patterned example that people use all the time to defend war, of just cause, humanitarian intervention might count as just too, as it is a response to the aggression of a regime against its own people. So sometimes we use this phrase humanitarian intervention rather than war to express a situation where forces from another country will go in and try to protect the people from some kind of unjust regime when it appears that they can't protect themselves. So in general, states that commit acts of aggression are thought to forfeit their rights, that is, give up their rights, including their right not to be warred against. So basically the principle here behind this idea is that once you perform an act of aggression, you can no longer argue that you have a right not to have someone be aggressive back to you, that you've kind of given up that right. So there are some reasons for being a little skeptical, perhaps, about this concept, this idea of humanitarian intervention. The name humanitarian implies this is about being humane, about being compassionate towards human beings and for the sake of human beings, for their good. Despite the name, it involves war or the threat of war if it is to be effective. Okay, so although it's meant to be a humanitarian intervention and not really war, it's always going to involve weapons. It's going to involve some kind of threat. Like if you don't settle down, if you don't stop oppressing your people, this could escalate. We could, get the big guns involved literally. So although this word humanitarian is meant to separate it from operations of war, in practice, the way it's used tends to be very, very closely connected, intimately connected to notions of war and actual war. And also it's worth making the point that almost all wars, at least these days, are justified on humanitarian grounds. It's for the sake of looking after people, protecting their rights. So we've got this related question that you might have thought of, which is, as ordinary citizens, as people who, if we're outside, the Department of Defence and we don't get all the information and there's a lot of classified information that even the media isn't allowed to have, et cetera, how are ordinary citizens meant to know about what is a moral war or intervention and what isn't? So there's also a more general point going on here about the centrality of moral justification in the waging of war, because basically we tend to accept that we need moral language to even consider agreeing to go to war, that we expect from our leaders or from anyone who's making decisions about war to explain the war and its justification in moral terms. Okay, so that's not really something, however much political realism there is, and even if a leader is secretly a political realist, they can't actually talk like that publicly most of the time, because the public does expect some talk about morality. They want to explain, they want you to clearly explain how this war might connect up with the morality that we have. So How do they do that? Well, leaders typically try to justify their wars in moral terms, and usually by highlighting the immorality of their enemies' behaviour or beliefs. And I'm sure you can think of examples in all of this. So at the moment, for instance, there's a lot of reports about atrocities being committed against Ukraine citizens by the Russian forces, and as well as being, news reports, these act as ongoing and are considered and are referred to by leaders as being the justification for the war that's going on at the moment. So an interesting book on this as an example of the kind of academic works that are out there about these kinds of issues. So this book by Michael Burley is called Moral Combat, A History of World War II. This is interesting because it follows all the different moral arguments that were given to justify actions by all the major players in World War II. So by both the Allies and the Axis. So it underscores the point that moral justification has just about always been provided for military actions by those instigating the actions, no matter how implausible the justification may seem. So he basically says, well, here's all these different actions that happened in World War II, a lot of them very confronting. And he says, look, in every single case, somebody gives some quasi-moral justification. So it tends to kind of, the result of reading this kind of book is you tend to think, well, this kind of moral justification seems pretty cheap. It's like anyone can come up with a moral justification for certain acts in war, however bad they are. So I guess that's where we come back to the reasons there are quite tight criteria given for the notion of just war, because without them, anyone can just say anything to morally justify what they do in war, however problematic. So an example of, I suppose, this is kind of a romantic militarism, but also about one of the complexities for citizens caught up in situations of war. So the play Henry V by William Shakespeare. I'll just read out this little excerpt. So King Henry says, methinks I could not die anywhere so contented as in the king's company, his cause being just and his cause honourably. William says, that's more than we know. And the other character, Bates, says, aye, and more than we should seek after, for we know enough, if know we are the king's subjects. If his cause be wrong, our obedience to the king wipes the crime of it out of us, end quote. So this is an example of citizens being really, really loyal to their king. Now, we don't have a king or queen, but we have a prime minister, we have a government, elected government. Citizens are placed in this position where there's this quality of loyalty that's expected. And so it's considered a moral good to be loyal to your leader or loyal to your country. And so this is a situation, this kind of extreme loyalty, where these characters are basically saying, look, my loyalty to the king is moral and it trumps everything else. And sure, it might turn out that the king was wrong. But even so, we were in the right because we obeyed the king, and obeying the king is morally right. And there's a belief, that the king is king because of divine right. The king has this quasi-divine authority. So there's this issue as well, framing justifications for war. Why are you justified in going to war? Well, because the king said, the king has judged it to be so. And, who am I to question the king? So you get this kind of idea, and you might think it's old-fashioned, but I think it tends to still be around in the sense that whenever there's a war, and you can see this in Australia, if Australia is involved in or supporting of, usually following America, if someone speaks out and says, well, I don't think we should be involved in this war, they can be sometimes considered to be unloyal, decried as disloyal and not appreciating their freedom and things like that. But we've also got this problem of preemption. So preemption means preempting or kind of predicting that someone is probably going to attack you, and so you attack them first. You get them first before they get you. So what happens to the principle of aggression here? It's on this principle, you don't wait for someone to be aggressive to you, for a country to be aggressive or whatever the enemy is, but you actually take them on first because you think, you don't know the future, but you think that it's probable that they're going to attack you. They're going to do something to you. So contemporary debates about the legitimacy of this basically centered around the various wars that the US has fought with Iraq, because one of the key issues there was a preemption, the idea that we need to get in before it escalates and before we become the victims. So traditionally, many have thought the concept of preemption is ruled out by just war theory, and that therefore preemptive wars are never just. They're necessarily never just. And that's certainly suggested by this self-defense analogy. The idea that, only if someone's attacking you, do you have a right to attack back? And if it's about self-defense, then how can you argue it's self-defense when somebody hasn't actually done anything to you? And we have also the issue of what's called a counterfactual in philosophy, which is something that's not a fact. And it could be a fact, but it's not a fact at the moment. So it hasn't happened yet. So you can't, how do you talk about things that haven't happened yet, or didn't happen, or might have happened but didn't, you know? I could have gone into a different room today, but I didn't. So how do I talk about that? What reality does that have? So the problem with preemption is you're talking about something that you think is a probability that the other side might attack you, but is actually very, very hard to prove. And it doesn't exist in any meaningful sense. So to go into the different criteria for just war, most importantly, the notion of just cause. Just cause implies that in a conflict, at most, one side has just cause. And the idea is that this will be the case even if it's hard to determine which. That from an outsider's point of view, you might not be able to see which side is in the right. But if you believe that it's a just war, it entails believing that one side is doing the right thing, and therefore, you know, they're fighting for peace, they're fighting to achieve a good end, and the other one isn't. So we have to separate the fact of the just cause from the question of whether and how we judge it. So objectively, a war might be just, and a reason to go to war might be just. But we, particularly as citizens, might be in a position where we say, honestly, I just don't know enough about this conflict to judge it one way or the other. But importantly, it doesn't imply that one side must be in the right, because remember, there's such a thing, on just war theory, there's such a thing as unjust war. Not all wars are automatically just. So it could be perfectly possible that both sides are wrong. Neither side is justified in going to war. But they will only admit that one can never be right at one time. So recalling the list again, war is justified if and only if it satisfies these conditions: just cause, right authority, right intent, peaceful ultimate goals, last resort, reasonable chance of success, and proportionality. So that's a lot. Are the wars we're familiar with going to meet any of those criteria, or all of them? So let's look at the second one, right authority. The group or entity that declares war, usually the government of a nation, has the legitimate authority to do so. Okay. So I, as lecturer in uni, I do not have the authority to declare war on behalf of Australia. Only certain people have the right to declare war. So how do we decide this? Which types of groups or entities may possess the relevant authority? Is it the nation states? Is it all the nation states or only the democratic ones? Because arguably, if they're not democratic, then the government hasn't really been given true authority to act on behalf of all its citizens. What about dictatorships? Could you argue that they lack a mandate to be able to declare war? So for instance, the president of North Korea, does he have a right to declare war? His citizens might say, well, no. And then we have supranational bodies, which are particularly controversial, for example, the UN, because not all countries in the world are members of the UN or support the UN. And so it continues to be controversial as an actor that has the right to kind of intervene in national politics. And then, of course, revolutionary movements. Do revolutions, revolutionary groups, guerrilla armies and so on have the right to officially declare war and say, this is it, we're going to war against whatever threat they perceive. particularly, I guess the question behind all this is how it affects, everybody else in the country. The reason the authority is important is because we're thinking about, do you have the authority to basically put everybody in your group at risk? So part of just war theory comes down to this question of legitimate governance. Do you have the right, the legitimate authority to declare war or enter into a war? And what confers on government or regime the legitimacy it requires in order to wage the just war? So there's a few puzzles you can consider here about right authority. So traditionally, war must be publicly declared to your own citizens and to the enemy state. So traditionally, the concept of a war means public war. You can't be waging a private war. If it's a private war, then it's, just some form of terrorism or something, or sabotage. But officially, war has to be publicly declared. So interestingly, a criticism of the war in Vietnam was that it was never formally declared. So US hasn't declared war since World War II. So every other conflict that the US has been involved in has been without a formal declaration of war. So often what happens is things that this is the question, what do we call war? Things that we might be inclined to naturally call war get called other things. Military action, armed response, and so on. You can think of lots of euphemisms for what appears to be a war. Two sides fighting each other and using military force. So part of the just war approach is acknowledging a war for what it is. Okay. So the idea that you shouldn't be trying to secretly wage war. If you believe in the concept of a just war, you need to own it, you need to declare it, and not try to call it something else. And this applies to civil wars too, that is wars within one country, between two sides within one country. Famously, America had its civil war. Which side is defending or fighting to establish a state with the above features? So there's interesting work on this by political theorist Charles Beard, perpetual war, perpetual peace, this phrase. So let's move on to number 3, last resort. The idea is all other avenues must have been exhausted. And this is a phrase, last resort, we use all the time. So for anything that's extreme, not just war, if it's extreme and extraordinary, then you try everything else you can before you try that one. And so you might think of this in a medical context. Okay, we'll operate on you, but only as a last resort. We'll try everything else first, but if nothing works, okay, we'll do the operation. So the argument is that, look, perhaps sometimes it's a necessary evil, but it is still an evil. So recognizing that it's something bad, it's something wrong in some way, it involves harm, then you don't go into it lightly. And the other interesting point from a practical point of view is that war can easily get out of control. It's really hard to foresee where it will lead. So you start a war and you just don't know how long it's going to go on for, and you don't know how many people are going to die, and you don't know how bad it's going to get. So here's an interesting question to apply to the wars we know about. To what extent were the wars in which we have been involved been matters of last resort? And there are 2 dangers here. One danger is rushing in too quickly, and some people argue the US with Iraq or Afghanistan. And then the other danger is taking too long to go to war. And so some historians, philosophers point to the appeasement of Nazi Germany. So people saying, wait, let's see if we can calm them down. Let's try diplomacy. We don't actually need to go to war. So it's seen as a very, very difficult political and diplomatic problem, especially when you don't really know where it's going to lead. So basically that principle is encouraging quite a conservatism when it comes to starting wars. You try everything else first, and you try to be very, very careful about and very deliberate about anything that would escalate the move towards war. Okay. Number 4, the aim has to be peace. So even if you go to war, your ultimate aim must be to secure peace. Now, this is a claim that peace studies looks at pretty skeptically because the idea that you can wage war to achieve peace is considered problematic. But this is part of just war theory. War can only be a means of securing a preferable state of peace, not an end in itself. So you can't go to war because you love war. You need to go to war because you want to achieve peace and have something good happen in the end. So, for instance, the war on terror has been criticised as a war without end. The claim is that the state of war itself is seen as an end, as there are certain political benefits to the US being permanently at war, rather than being a short-term means to a better peace. And also related to this criticism is the idea that it's not even clear what the end of such a war would be. And you can think about this with the US's war on drugs, even though it's meant as a metaphor. It's the kind of war that doesn't clearly ever come to an end. What would constitute an end realistically? So this is connected to the idea of the just cause. Why am I justified in entering into a war in the first place? Because I really need to achieve peace. And if I'm not trying to do that, I'm not justified. Number 5, right intent. So it's not sufficient that there be a morally sound reason for going to war. That reason must be the reason why one goes to war. It must be the motivating reason. So this one is a little bit tricky, but just bear with me. So basically the idea is there could be several reasons to do something like go to war. And one of the reasons might be that I really love war. I'm a belligerent person and I love waging war. And I go to war because I'm a belligerent person. And also, I'm going to war against an unjust regime that's really hurting its people. So the second reason might be a good reason to go to war, but actually that wasn't my reason. My reason was I'm just a belligerent person. I'm constantly trying to start fights with everybody. That would not be acceptable. It doesn't matter that there's another reason that happens to fit my war situation. If that wasn't the reason I went to war, then it doesn't count. So one case that's often talked about is the war in Iraq. Many claim that although the motivations of the US were based on geopolitical considerations, securing oil, asserting US global dominance, etc., there was still good moral grounds for going to war, removing a tyrannical regime, and so on. So if you believed that, Saddam Hussein was very tyrannical and was treating his people very badly, then you could arguably present the view that you were doing the just thing in going ahead with this war. But according to just war theory, the existence of these latter reasons isn't enough to make the war just. The mere fact that those reasons exist aren't enough. They have to be the reasons why the US went to war. So a lot of particularly peace activists, but a lot of people who still believe in just war don't believe this war was a just war because they don't believe those were the real reasons. They believe that they don't believe that was the reason the US went to war against Iraq. It wasn't because they wanted to save the citizens from Saddam Hussein. It was for these other geopolitical reasons. So that's an interesting one, I think. And it does speak to, I think, a broader issue of how do we ever find out what the leaders of a country's real aims are? Because all we can go on is what they tell us. And number 6, reasonable chance of success. If there's no reasonable chance of success, well, what's happening? You're just pointlessly wasting lives. So there's a practical element to all of this. Given the information you have at the time, you need to really believe that you have a chance of succeeding and achieving the peace that you're meant to be trying for, right? So for example, a nuclear strike by the US on the USSR during the Cold War would have inevitably led to mutual annihilation. You could argue there was no chance of success. There was nothing that could be success in this situation. They would have just launched nuclear weapons against each other and everyone would have died. So it also seems to imply that war should not be continued once victory becomes impossible. So once you realize you're not going to win, you've lost the chance of success. And so then you're just killing people for the sake of it. So, for example, Nazi Germany continuing to fight when it became clear that defeat was inevitable. You could argue that many lives were wasted for no reason. There's some puzzle cases associated with this one too. And this is sort of to do with how we think about David and Goliath type situations where you have the little person with less power fighting against the bigger people or group with more power. And that phrase you might have heard of, better to die on your feet than live on your knees. So we kind of admire those who fight even when the odds are so overwhelmingly against them. And there are some historical examples, the small country Poland resisting the much more powerful country of Nazi Germany in World War II. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where Jews who had been, hounded into this ghetto resisted. And it was one of the not very well documented cases where they actually did resist. They fought back and they had no chance, but they fought back. The 300 Spartans, to go back to ancient history, standing their ground against the Persians. And slave uprisings, for example, Spartacus. There'd be famous cases of slaves rising up when they have such little power compared to their masters. So if it's true that you're only justified in waging war against someone if you have a reasonable chance of winning, what do we say about these cases? Because we want to say these were just. It was just to fight in these situations. So this is a tricky one, isn't it? And finally, we have, last but not least, proportionality. The end should be proportional to the means used. The usual example, the common example we use, it's sort of a silly example, but is you don't throw a brick at the fly on the window, right? Use a fly swatter or swat it away. But sure, you might get the fly if you throw the brick, but you'll break your window, and that's very silly. It's not worth it to just get rid of one little fly. So you have to use means that are proportional. So don't use nuclear weapons, for instance, to deal with a small border dispute. You have to weigh the benefits of the war against the costs, especially casualties, that is, the number of people who die in the war. And only if the benefits are worth the costs can the war be just. Now, I'm sure you can see there's another issue here, which is under that general issue of how do we know when someone starts a war, how do they know how it's going to end? And so you've got to make a judgment about proportionality in the time, but you don't really know how much it's going to escalate. And maybe at the end of a long war that goes on for years and years and kills so many people, you might say, gee, I shouldn't have started that war. That benefit of hindsight issue. So it's a tricky one. So the other side of this was jus in bello, how to conduct yourself in war. So we started the war, we think we're justified, but you still got this issue of how can killing in war ever be justified, given killing is usually considered morally wrong. So I make reference to the boxing analogy. This is a famous analogy that's used, which says basically if you go and train as a boxer and you agree to be in a fight, you can't complain about getting hit. And also the other guy can't complain about you hitting them. Right. So basically, if you consent to be in a war as a combatant, then your consent overrides the otherwise immorality of the killing. If I consent to the killing, then the killing isn't wrong. If I consent to the risk, then it's not wrong. So the background to contemporary debates about the conduct of war is the advent of what's called total war, where war used to involve just the soldiers, usually men and older boys, going into battle, and everybody else was out of it. But war doesn't anymore just involve armies on the battlefield. It involves the whole of the nation, the whole of society. So nowhere's safe. You could be just minding your own business in a suburban house and someone can bomb you if your country's at war. Civilians are no longer seen as off limits. Cities are bombed. So within this principle, there are two main further principles. Proportionality, so we've looked at that in another context. For any particular military action, do the benefits outweigh the costs? And the principle of non-combatant or civilian or innocent immunity or discrimination. So what that means is non-combatants, people who aren't soldiers, who haven't agreed to combat in war, they should be granted immunity from the war. They should be protected. Their lives should not be at risk. So this is sometimes called discrimination because you need to be able to discriminate positively between those who have agreed to be combatants and those who haven't. If you're not in the army, you should not be at risk. So in the case of proportionality, a famous example is when Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, millions of men were said to have been slaughtered. and millions more enslaved. 800 cities were destroyed. Now, arguably, these costs were way out of proportion to the benefits of the victory. And also, of course, violates that non-combatant immunity clause. And many military actions would actually violate both of these. And it is possible to violate proportionality without violating non-combatant immunity. Even if you're only attacking combatants, even if you're only attacking, say, a group of soldiers, you might be using disproportionate force. If you just want to make them surrender, why do you have to actually kill them? You know, so there could be a way to make them surrender without actually killing them. You can take prisoners of war, for instance. So Winston Churchill had something interesting to say about this principle of discrimination. He said, "It is absurd to consider morality on this topic. In the last war, the bombing of open cities was regarded as forbidden." When he says last war, he means World War I. Now everybody does it as a matter of course. It's simply a question of fashion changing, as she does between long and short skirts for women. So what camp do you think this guy belongs to? Maybe a realist? It's absurd to consider morality on this topic. You know, it's just people change their minds. He's sort of being skeptical here about there being any, objective truth about the matter here. So famously in World War II, there starts to be this carpet bombing, this situation where you go and you just lay down bombs like a carpet over an entire city and kill huge amounts of people, civilians, at one time. This is a painting by Picasso called Guernica. It was a response to the horror of the bombing of this town in Spain by German planes in 1937. And the horror for many involved the bombing of civilians, the non-combatants. And the bombing gave a glimpse of how war was to be prosecuted shortly in the Second World War with the indiscriminate carpet bombing of cities. So this was Picasso's very personal response to the horror of this. Now, interestingly, do you remember Marty Brannigan mentioned that Picasso actually designed that dove of peace symbol that we are all familiar with now? And so I found this image. This is from 1949. So that last one was 1937, just before World War II. This is after World War II, when the world is still trying to reckon with the terrible, terrible destruction that happened, and so much torture and so much rape and just so horrific things. And so there was this movement for peace, and Picasso was invited to create this image. And this image in a simplified version became that dove of peace image that we see at protests and things all around the world. And it gets associated with the UN. So I mentioned that there's a long tradition of talking about just war. This is from a Confucian philosopher from about 300 BC, known as Zunzi. And this is from a piece he wrote debating military affairs. He said, "The king's army does not kill the enemy's old men and boys. It does not destroy crops. It does not seize those who retire without a fight, but it does not forgive those who resist." So here you can see an example of someone saying, discriminate. It's important not to just kill everybody. You don't kill the old men who can't fight. You don't kill the little boys. You don't try to why would you destroy crops? You don't try to destroy people's food. You fight those who resist. You fight the combatants, the ones who fight back. But everyone else, you leave them alone. Principle of proportionality also, but discrimination too. Discriminate between who's a fighter and who isn't in a war. And so that's really ancient wisdom there. So some people argue that the unintentional deaths of non-combatants might be acceptable, or could be called collateral damage, as a side effect of attacks on legitimate targets. Okay, so you might have heard this phrase, collateral damage, became very popular in the 90s and onwards with the war in Iraq. So if you're not intending to hurt civilians, if you say try to bomb a factory, but there's suburban houses around the factory and people accidentally get killed as a result of the bomb, you weren't actually trying to hurt the civilians, you were trying to destroy the factory. So the idea here is that you can't seek the deaths of non-combatants deliberately. Now, this is a quite old principle from theology, from Catholic theology, called the principle of double effect. The idea is that when you commit certain acts, there are two effects, and what matters is your intention. So you cannot intend to kill someone, but you can sometimes do something, for example, defend yourself, that you recognise will have the side effect that someone will be killed. So this principle is appealed to in the idea of self-defence. someone tries to attack you, you fight back. You didn't want to kill them, but you were trying to defend yourself and you understood that maybe that could happen. And sure enough, they die. And you argue, look, I'm not a murderer. I didn't want to kill them. I was just trying to defend myself. So in the law, intention is very important. It's the difference between being a murderer and being convicted of manslaughter. If you accidentally drive into someone and kill them, you can be charged with manslaughter, but not murder because you weren't trying to kill them. So that's the idea, the principle that is trying to be articulated here. So two acts may have the same consequences, a person's death, but differ with respect to intent. Now, this is a very controversial principle. Not everyone finds it that convincing. So the idea that, oh, look, I wasn't trying to hurt these civilians, but I knew that they would probably get hurt when I did this action. You could argue, look, if you knew that was going to happen, you shouldn't be doing it. So I guess it depends on how bad you think the killing of civilians is. So tactical bombing, as an example, the tactical bomber attacks a military target in a densely populated area, knowing that civilians in the surrounding area will be killed. Terror bombing, the terror bomber drops weapons in a civilian area, hoping thereby to lower morale and force or hasten a surrender. So this one is a bit less convincing. So this one is basically, I am trying to basically, the idea is I'm not trying to kill the civilians, but I am trying to lower morale. Lower morale of who? Well, lower morale of the civilians. So you're going to terrorize everybody and make them say, okay, we give up, we surrender. That seems very, very close to basically wanting to hurt them and wanting them to be so terribly scared that they just kind of give up. So, you know, this is a very tricky area to justify using this principle, I think. Okay, another problem associated with, or puzzle associated with the idea of discrimination is it requires us to distinguish between competence and non-competence, or military and civilians. Arguably, this used to be reasonably straightforward, not anymore, given total war. So here's some interesting puzzle questions for you. Should the following people be immune? Workers in munitions factories, making the weapons. Politicians prosecuting the war, so pro-war politicians. Journalists writing propaganda for the other side. Transport workers transporting the soldiers and the weapons. Cooks preparing food for soldiers. Farmers growing the food. Where does this stop? Another example. Oh, it would come back to me. I was thinking of something else. Oh, yes. So anybody who invests in companies that produce weapons. So we were talking about that with Marty Brannigan. What if you invest in a company that produces weapons? Are you a fair target now? So who are combatants? The narrow view is enemy soldiers. The broad view is anyone who's contributing to the enemy's war effort. A question here is there a position in between these two extremes that could be defended? So that's something to think about. Maybe it's not so, it's not one extreme or the other. So I've just put a list here in the slides, which I'll put up on Moodle for some interesting further reading about these topics. As you can see, it's really complex, but as you go through those 7 stringent conditions for just war, it does make you wonder, how can we ever judge whether any war is particularly just? So Isabel has just asked a question, what about brainwashing of the masses and propaganda to justify the justness and morality of the war? Who decides who is just? So that's interesting because that might pertain to that case of journalists, or these days probably social media influencers, or members of government who constantly sort of pump out information about what the enemy is meant to be doing. And for the sake of the argument, we could accept maybe they're not doing that. So somebody's actually lying about what the other side is doing. This is part of the problem. It's an epistemic issue too, to do with theory of knowledge. Epistemic means to do with how we know things. So we've got this problem of, yes, propaganda in war, and who decides what is right? Who's making the decisions about what is true and what isn't? And how do we make those decisions? And Isabel, I'm glad you raised that because it just is particularly complicated these days with social media and with getting lots of different reports. We've come to the end of the hour and I believe someone else will be lecturing in this room. So I'm going to have to end now. Thank you so much for attending. We have a toot immediately afterwards, which I'll start in a minute. So everyone's welcome to attend. And I'll put our discussion questions up on Moodle. So please participate online if you don't have a chance to join the toot. Thanks, everybody.